Okay, students, it's time for your English tip of the week.
I'm pleased to welcome Jan Keck and Luke Hobbs to the show today. Luke is a language coach from On the Spot Language here in Toronto and was a guest host back in September. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hey, so happy to be here.
Now, Jan has created a deep conversation guide, and he's also working on a podcast called Deep Connectors. And he has also created a deep question chat bot. I mean, it's really incredible. So he's originally from Germany, and his passion is to help people get connected with people, and not just on the surface, not just small talk. Now, Jan, I want to read a blurb from your website, which is www.jankeck.com, and we'll link that on our James Rice Show website because it's really interesting, and I want to read it to the audience. Growing up in Germany, I felt invisible most of my childhood as the shy kid who really socialized a lot with others. I would rarely speak in my class or raise my hand in class. And I read that and I thought, Jan, it's really moving. It's incredibly moving. And I know you struggled with shyness most of your life or through your life. I'd like you to maybe share a bit of your story before we get into some of the deep questions and how you broke free from your shyness.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to share that a little bit. So as you said, I grew up in Germany and I was and still am an only child. And I think that was one of the reasons why I, at one point in my life, subconsciously started looking for like a community to join. It's taken a lot of my a lot of courage, I think, to be not the quiet kid in class, and it took me a long time to kind of step out of that. And I think looking back, there was one moment in high school where another student came up to me and said, "Hey, there's this student, the city youth council, that are looking for new people to join, and I think you'd be great for it." And I didn't really know that person that well, but something in what he said kind of resonated, and I'm like, city youth council, that sounds like a cool thing. Like I could actually be representing my whole school or my whole like age group in front of the city and kind of promote issues and change things. And up until then, I don't think I've ever done public speaking, but to run for the student or city youth council, I had to almost do like a campaign. So we had to go to the other schools and stand in front of classes of strangers and tell them what we would do if we get elected. And that was one of the first few times where I had to do the public speaking, aside from doing like presentations in front of class, but it was always very terrifying. I never wanted to be the center of attention. Like all eyes on me was like the most uncomfortable thing for me. But in a way, I just kept pushing that comfort zone, and I kept doing it. I ended up getting elected into the City Youth Council, then became the co-chair. Then after that became one of the chairs for the provincial City Youth Council organization, and it kind of just kept going from there. Like I just was seeking out more of those roles where I actually had to be the center of attention, for better or worse. And
yeah, absolutely.
Like, practice makes perfect. And there was one thing that really got me out of it, which was the courage to be in that uncomfortable spot, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you came to Canada. When did you come to Canada? 2010?
2008 for the first time. So it's about like 10 years ago.
Okay. And one of the things that I caught when I was reading through your blog was that you found it very challenging to build a rapport with strangers and kind of move beyond small talk. And this is really difficult for ESL students. They often can do a little small talk, but they often fade. And if they're at a party or an event, they just kind of fade into the corner and kind of give up, going beyond small talk. And you created a guide on how to do this. Could you give us some insights about what the guide is about and what you've found to get past that small talk?
Yeah. So for me, when I came to Canada, my English was pretty good. I already had spent a year traveling in Australia. That's where I pretty much picked up the language, because in school I wasn't very good in like English class. I barely graduated that class. But when I came to Canada, I've realized that people here are super friendly, but mostly on the surface. Like, it was really easy to start up a conversation with people. Once you kind of connected with someone at an event, like immediately you're talking about all kinds of things. But
Usually the weather.
Usually the weather is one of the topics, especially if it's too cold, too hot, too wet, or too dry. But it's really hard to get to that next level of relationships. And I always thought, I wonder, is that because I'm German, and in Germany it's really hard to kind of have those easy conversations in the beginning, but once you get to know someone, you get to know them really well. You go deep really quickly, like your best friends, after just a couple of times hanging out. And maybe in Canada it just takes longer. And it took me about 8 years before I had this feeling of belonging for the first time in a group of people that I met at a weekend retreat. And it was that weekend that I realized, oh my God, those are my people. And that was exactly what was missing from when I moved to Canada. But I didn't know. I didn't know that until I had that experience. So the guide is actually based on almost deconstructing some of the things that happened that weekend and the things that I did afterwards to help me connect with people in a more meaningful way.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of how it came about.
All right, let's bring Luke into the conversation, because one of the things Jan created was something called deep question cards. And Luke, you've been using these in your class. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah. So, firstly, hi everyone, and thank you for bringing me on the show, James. It's great to be here. And Jan and I just started. I actually started. Jan, correct me if I'm wrong. The company is called Ask Deep Questions. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I got introduced through CSI, and we had these, and I saw some of these cards, and as soon as I saw them, I thought, this is so brilliant, because we really, even among family members and friends, we don't really talk about these things, and yet at on the spot language, we tend to ask people on the street, in public, questions all the time, and we thought this would be really fun and interesting to try. So we just tried it in our class, and it's the questions that we asked. Am I allowed to share it? Is it okay?
Yes, of course.
Give us a couple of examples.
So what we did was I thought I'll introduce my students to the cards, and they can choose. They can choose which ones they wanted to ask and answer. So my students chose, if you could go back anywhere you've been, where would you go? So that was interesting, because they were wondering, do you mean like time and space, or just a place, go back, but into the future? Like, so it was very interesting to even think about the question. I guess I left it open for them. The next question was, what advice did your parents give you? And it's really great to think about these kinds of questions. Like, what advice did your parents give you will absolutely probably be related to culture as well. As I know, to ask these questions on the street, we usually approached groups of strangers that were, seeming friends. And when we asked them these questions, like, what is the next milestone in your life? They usually first respond by, looking up and back and thinking, wow, you can see it on their face. Like, wow, I didn't expect these kinds of big questions. But they're really, it was followed directly by a smile, and they started answering these questions. And I could see that their friends also they probably didn't have these kinds of conversations with their friends that were right beside them. And yet with our, English language learners that we were with, we were asking these questions, and we were kind of going around in a circle and answering them, and our students would do the same. So we felt it was really rewarding, and we could actually get a lot of accidental language learning through the process, a lot of cultural understanding. We spoke to people that weren't originally from Canada, so we got a huge mix of answers, and we all felt kind of, more connected after that.
And people were open. They were open to sharing?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I thought might happen. Like, I wondered, from what I understand, these questions came from what was called a family deck. And I think Jan had in mind that these could be questions you might pose to your family. In fact, the question, what advice did your parents, what advice did your parents give you? Maybe not, but there was another question. How would you describe your family in 5 words? Well, I actually changed that question. How would you describe our family in 5 words? Was the original question. So,
so the ESL students asked Canadians on the street these questions.
Yeah.
And what was the reaction of the ESL students?
The ESL students, that's a really good question. So the ESL students were mostly playing catch up because, these questions usually, get quite deep. But we actually voice recorded it all, so that for their future learning. So I told them the most important thing is that you don't have to remember everything or learn you're not going to probably understand everything they say, but as much as you can, pick out the keywords and ask questions. So, how would you describe your family in 5 words? One of the answers, besides warm, crazy, and all these others, I remember one word was dysfunctional. 100%. Our students are not going to know that, but it's a great word. It can be useful in many situations. So our student said, sorry, what do you mean by dysfunctional? What do you mean by that? And we picked out like that, these kinds of meanings.
Now, Jan, one of the things students would say is, I can't understand what they're going to say to me. And how did you overcome that? Because obviously, as Luke mentioned, the vocabulary that people come back with when asked a deep question is something that's not really taught in ESL textbooks and materials. So what advice would you give, and how did you overcome that kind of fear?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a little bit different because by the time I was able to ask or started asking these meaningful questions, these deep questions, my English was already a lot better. This deck of cards is only a year old. So I've been living in Canada for 9 years, in English-speaking countries for 10. So by that time, my English was just I already knew a lot of the, I didn't have trouble understanding the different keywords.
I see. So you had more trouble kind of finding your community.
That and having there's 3 different levels to the Ask Deep Questions deck, and all of them are deep questions. But the first level is called Curious, which is just below the surface. But then there's 2 levels deeper. The next one is Brave, and the one at the bottom is Vulnerable. And I usually explain that if you've never been swimming, you want to use a Curious card to kind of go in the kiddie pool and get used to the water. And then a Brave card would be the equivalent of maybe going to a lake and taking some practice strokes there. And then the Vulnerable cards is going to the ocean, going free diving without oxygen tank. So the vulnerable questions might be things you might have not ever shared with anyone or asked anyone. And I felt really uncomfortable asking those questions to my friends. Yet when you just pick a card and read out the question, it's much less pressure.
Now you have the same idea with the deep question chatbot as well, right?
Yeah, that is basically based on the cards. So it's just like a interactive digital version of the card deck.
Yeah, I tried it out. It's really cool. It asked me some deep questions. Had to think about it.
Actually, the funny thing is that a bunch of times people decide to answer to the chatbot, and then I get people's answers kind of come in, which is sometimes quite funny.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Now, one of the things that you talked about, Jan, and maybe Jan and Luke, you can give some advice to students out there listening. How do they break into or get invited into a community of native speakers?
Luke, do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I know we've been. I know that Anish has been on the show and before, and then we came on in September. So some of the listeners may already know what we do, but basically, we think of newcomers as people in need of a lot of support, and they need to be guided into how to connect with people. And the best way to connect with people is to have a shared passion. You can't ask for something better than that. So we usually go to areas of the city where we can find those kinds of people. We design questions, not necessarily all deep questions, but we'd make custom surveys for our students based on their interests, passions, goals, and things that they want to accomplish while they're here. So if you're interested in tourism, then you can start asking people, or like traveling, you can start asking people about where they've been and where they'd recommend and what those places, what were the highlights of their trip. Or if they wanted to connect with, for example, the LGBTQ community, then we give them tasks to research events and to make goals to how many events they want to go to, and reach out to the community directly and ask questions. It's actually by using English that they're able to meet people and feel confident, like they have the tools to start the conversation and to ask follow-up questions and to show their interest. And that's usually how it goes for them. And they're able to, do both of those things that I've mentioned and many more things.
Yeah. And Jan, how did you break into some communities here in Canada?
Yeah, let me just add on to what Luke said, because the students have this one sentence, this one opening line that I find is the best way to start any conversation if you are meeting someone, which is basically starting with a little bit of vulnerability, where they say, "Excuse me, I'm an ESL student and I'm practicing English. Can I ask you a question?" So I've used the same kind of methodology when I went to, let's say, a networking event. And I would say, "Hey, I feel really out of place here because everybody here works at a company and I don't. Can we have a conversation?" Or like starting with actually acknowledging that you feel uncomfortable or that you are learning something is the best way to have people open up.
Amazing.
Yeah,
all
absolutely.
of us do the same thing. We almost call it the survey introduction. It's formally written down for them, and it usually goes something like, "I'm an international student studying English in Toronto, and one of my goals while I'm here is to connect with people in the LGBT community. Do you mind if I ask you some questions?" And things like it goes on from there. But it's amazing how similar that is.
Yeah, and I've done it when I first moved to Toronto as well, where I just offered to volunteer for events for like organizations or clubs that I wanted to meet people at. So one of the first organizations that I went to was the documentary film organization of Canada.
Wow.
And I just started volunteering because one of the first people that I met at the first event was the organizer, because I'm German. I arrived mostly on time. So I was the only one there. Everybody else arrived, of course, a little bit late. So I talked to the organizer. We started to connect, and then I basically offered, "Hey, do you ever need volunteers for events?" And the best thing was have sitting at the entrance table and having to check people in, because suddenly I'm learning names of all the people that are there. Everybody gets to meet me. So when I talk to them afterwards, with some drinks in my hands or in our hands, it was a lot easier to already go into a more interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I lived in Japan, I actually found an ice hockey team. And that's how I got into the community. because, of course, being Canadian, we all play hockey, right, Luke? And at some point in our lives, so I was able to actually join an ice hockey team, and that got me into a community, and not only that hockey community, but then people wanted to come and watch me play. And we created a little party after the hockey games and things like that, and my community began to grow. So even though it was in Japan, students listening out there, there was one little hockey team, and sometimes it would take me 90 minutes to get there to the games or something like that. But it was something that I could connect with easily. And as Jan said, it's documentary film. So whatever hobby or passion you have, you can get out there and meet people through that hobby. And I know a lot of students enjoy cooking. So there's a lot of cooking events out there. Of course, film, art, all sorts of events that they can participate in. One of the other things, Jan, that I noticed in your on your website rather was when people go to a conference, you have some tips for them. And I think they're kind of good tips just in general. And I wanted to share a couple with the listeners. One tip that you said was skip the small talk. Skip the small talk. And what do you mean by that?
I think there's, especially in Canada, people like to talk about the weather. People like to talk about things that are comfortable. Most of the time, especially at a business type networking event, people always ask, so what do you do? And I feel like that question actually puts you in a box that you sometimes have a really hard time climbing out of. So I've been in that situation myself from the other side, where I would meet somebody, I would ask them, say, hey, so what do you do? They tell me they're a lawyer, and immediately I'm not interested in talking to them anymore. Although they might be doing some really cool things in their free time. Maybe they're a new parent as I am, and there's so many things that we could be talking about. But because that was how we started, we might not ever get to those interesting stories that really connect us. So there's some different questions that I like to ask people at networking events, or that are just a little bit different. They're kind of the curious level questions. And one of them that I love is, what's something exciting that you're working on these days? Because that gives people the option to either talk about their work. If they love what they do, they will, most of the time, if they're entrepreneurs, they love talking about new things that they're creating with their business. But for the studies that have shown that 80% of people don't like their job, they will not talk about their work. They might talk about a little gardening project or a vacation that they are planning with their family. And immediately you have people talking about something positive, and it's much easier to connect on something that you both enjoy doing rather than complaining about something that you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And another one that I saw in there, Jan, that I want to share because I think it's really important, is give the gift of presence. Give the gift of presence. Not a not a present like a Christmas present, but presence. Be there. Can you explain that one?
Yeah. It seems that we're more connected than ever because we all have this kind of supercomputer in our pockets all the time, that we have all these social media apps and we're constantly texting and messaging people. But at the same time, we kind of forget that when we have face-to-face meetings, when we meet somebody for a coffee or for dinner, we're supposed to actually be present in that moment rather than being on our phones and distracted. And it's very easy to, like, anytime your phone vibrates and it's in your pocket, or you hear the notification bell go off, to just immediately go to your phone. And if you've ever been in the situation where you're talking to someone and they get a message and suddenly the phone is more important than you know exactly how it feels being on the other side. So what I mean with giving the gift of presence is really when you want to spend quality time with people, just either turning your phone off completely or leaving it in your bag will help you just make the other person feel so special, and you'll have a much easier time connecting with them.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice. All right, Luke, any final thoughts on how to move from that small talk to deep conversation?
Well, I have to say the advice that Jan gave is incredible, because we touched on the idea of giving, being vulnerable yourself will invite vulnerabilities, and that's probably the biggest takeaway that we've been doing that with our students, and it's worked, and it's can work in all situations, and being present, like Jan said, is a really good one. I can't agree more, and I think that ultimately that will be a gift to yourself as well, because even if that person, everyone you talk to, they might not have that same awareness. They may not think, okay, I also don't want to check my phone. They may also feel like they want to check their phone, but I think that if you give your presence to someone, they will feel that much more connected to you, and they'll also may pick up on that, and they may realize subconsciously that they also, for some reason, don't want to pick up their phone, that there's something magical happening in this conversation. So I think it'll be a gift for yourself to also take a break from your phone, and it will also be a gift to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can think of a friend of mine that never uses the phone in front of me and is very, very deep into what I'm saying. And I feel almost when I'm meeting this person, I got to be ready, because they're actually paying attention to what I'm saying.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So you can sort of spread the gift of presence around. It's fantastic. Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of the theme of Ask Deep Questions at its heart is it's kind of containing every aspect of this notion of a person who's coming to a new country who feels out of place for a multitude of reasons. I mean, that's something we can all relate with. I think when we go to those events, we could almost say that when people say, "So, what do you do?" It's actually a safeguarded question for their own self, and it's great. The more people that can wake others up, I think that probably from Jan's experience, a lot of people feel like, wow, that's a great question, and they're refreshed by having genuine conversations. And going forward in the future, I can only imagine that to be something that's going to be needed more and respected more and appreciated more as we do that. And I think and I'm in full. I love that we are doing this. Yeah.
All right, Jan, any final advice for the students out there or teachers?
So I love what you just said there, Luke, because I believe that we all have this fundamental need to be seen and to be heard. And it doesn't happen these days anymore that somebody asks you a question and then is actually interested in the answer. Like the reason why everybody asks, so what do you do, is because they don't have a better question, I believe. That they actually don't want to know what you do. They don't want to talk about that either. It's just like, this is almost kind of a autopilot question that comes out. And if I had to give one last tip on how to find your people in a new place, it starts with going to events and looking at what other communities are out there. But I think the way you can really speed the whole process up is by becoming a hub or like event organizer yourself. So if you can create something for other people and focus on connecting the people that you might have connected with already and creating an experience for them. Let's say, I don't know, you go for a photo walk. I'm just like thinking what actually happened when I came here, like people going for photo walks or going for hikes, or one thing that I started doing is hosting these dinner parties where I invite a group of 5-6 people, and then we'll have my Ask Deep question cards there to facilitate the meaningful conversations. But the more you can be vulnerable with people, the faster you'll connect. On the box, I put a quote: relationships travel at the speed of vulnerability. And I totally believe that will be the fastest way to connect with people.
Absolutely. And I think we'll end on that note. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Jan, for coming on. Thanks, Luke.
My pleasure.
Thank you.